Hello and welcome to the RMI Advantage video training series. Today we're going to discuss 1099s within Advantage. The topics that will be covered in this class will be defining a 1099 and identifying who receives a 1099, how to add it to a vendor card within Advantage. We'll also learn how to process 1099 transactions. We'll learn how to fix 1099 information in the vendor ledger entries and also take a look at some reports that are available to you within Advantage. We'll get started first by defining exactly what a 1099 is and the individuals that usually receive it. 1099 forms are used for a number of reasons, though typically they're given to individual contractors or also known as freelancers. This is to record the income that they received from your organization. Since the person receiving the 1099 is not an employee of your business, the business is obligated to provide this income information to the contractor in the form of a 1099. It's important to point out that we report payments in the tax year, not the invoices. Therefore, only those payments made within the tax year are reported when the invoice is flagged as 1099. And I'll go into this in more detail once we take a look at the vendor ledger entries. Now that we've defined a 1099 and identified who would receive a 1099, let's go ahead and take a look at how 1099s work within Advantage. Welcome to Advantage. We'll get started here by taking a look at one of our vendor cards. Within Advantage, I'd go to Financial Management, go to Payables, and move down to Vendors. Here we have our vendor card for Robert Gradle. Now, Robert is someone that we typically work with and we contract out to do some installation work for us. We have them set up as a vendor because, again, we contract Robert out. If we move to the Payments tab of this vendor card, we'll see that we have this field here for 1099 code, and we do have a 1099 code specified for Robert. And when I drill into this field, we'll see here the IRS 1099 codes that we have. Now, the 1099 codes are updated by the government, and RMI does send a notice so that our clients can update their codes and amounts. Here we have Robert flagged as miscellaneous 07, and that's non-employee compensation. There's a few things to note here. Here we have our reportable amount of $600, and it's a minimum reportable amount, meaning that if we process less than $600 worth of invoices for Robert, we don't generate a 1099 for him. The system won't look to generate one. Another thing to note in this window is this code here called miscellaneous. This is simply a header for all of the miscellaneous codes that we have. If I select this code on a vendor card, the system will not pull up this vendor in any of my reports. This is simply just a header for all of the miscellaneous codes that we have. So in order to have miscellaneous information come through on our reports, you must select a code with a number following it. When I move back to our vendor card, we have one other field here called the Federal ID number. Typically, when you're dealing with another business that is a vendor, you put in their Federal ID number here. Because we contract Robert out, we will go ahead and put in his Social Security number. Then this information will show up on our 1099 form. Now that we've taken a look at the vendor card and where we would select the 1099 code for any of our vendors, we're going to go ahead and process an invoice. I'll generate my number, and I'll go ahead and select Robert. I have the invoice right in front of me, so I'm going to go ahead and put that number in. And down below on the lines, I'm going to start listing out all the work that Robert has done for us. He did some installation for us. He gets paid at regular hours. And he worked on this particular job for 6 hours. He gets paid $55 an hour. Now here we have this 1099 liable field. You'll notice right now that there isn't a check mark placed in it because our line has not yet been validated. When I move off of this line to have it validate, the check mark comes through. Now the reason why the system generated that check mark for me was because on Robert's vendor card we did specify a 1099 code for Robert. It is important to note that this field is editable. So if it was determined that this particular invoice did not qualify for the 1099, I could come in here and uncheck it and override the information that the system put in. In our case, it is liable for 1099. So I'm going to go ahead and place that check mark in there again. Now that we're all set, I'll just go ahead and post this. Now that we've posted that invoice, we'll move on to the vendor ledger entries and take a look at how that information is reflected under the vendor card. We'll come back here to Robert and we'll see that our amount has been updated for the invoice that we just processed. And in our ledger entries, we'll see the invoice that we just posted right here below. It came through with our miscellaneous code because we do have the code specified on Robert's vendor card, and the amount also carried through. The reason why it's open is because we haven't processed any payments for it. And this is why it's important that we know that we report on the payments in the tax year, not the invoices. So right now, if I ran my report, even though this invoice is flagged as miscellaneous, until a payment is posted for this invoice, this amount will not show up on any of my reports. You'll notice a couple of other things here for Robert. You'll see that in these invoices up above, there is not any 1099 information. I am aware that these invoices should have been flagged as 1099. Typically, the rule of thumb with vendor ledger entries or posted transactions is that you can't make any changes to the transaction once it's been posted. 1099 information is the exception to this rule. So here from our vendor ledger entries, although we didn't post it with the 1099 information, we can come here after the fact and update it so that that information will come through on all of our reports and forms. Another important thing to note is that if we did run our report as of right now, you'll see that the only invoice that has a payment and has the 1099 code and amount specified is right here. This is for an amount of $275. You'll remember that our reportable amount is $600. So again, if I ran my 1099 reports, Robert would not show up because we didn't hit that $600 minimum. Once we update all of our invoices, we will hit that minimum, and that's what we'll do right now. In order to edit the 1099 code information, you can double click in the 1099 code field, or you can hit F2, and that makes the field editable. I'll drill in and select my code, and it's my number 7 here. And when I tab over, my amount becomes editable, and I'll go ahead and enter in my amount of $275. I'll do the same for the other invoices. I'll hit F2, drill in, and select my code. And I'll also put in my amount. Now, if I ran a report for 1099 information, Robert would show up. We're well over our $600 minimum, and the invoices that should have been flagged with a 1099 code now have been. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the reports available to you within Advantage. If I move down to Reports, we'll start first by taking a look at the vendor 1099 information. Now this provides us vendor 1099 information for all of our vendors. I can filter on one vendor, and I can filter on a date or any date range that I'd like. I'm going to go ahead and leave it filtered on Robert, and I'm going to filter my date for this entire year. When I preview that, Robert shows up, and we have our amount here, $880. Now, if you remember, we still had 2 invoices open, so if I processed a payment for either of those invoices, that amount would be added to this 1099 amount. This report is typically used internally, and it gives you the 1099 information across the board for all of your vendors and all of the codes that you have transactions for. Once you've taken a look at this, from here, we'll probably want to go ahead and process our 1099 information. And you can do that within Advantage. We'll move down to our Documents area. And from here, you'll see that we have 3 reports for the different types of 1099 information that we can print out. I'm going to take a look at the miscellaneous one. Now that we have this here, you can filter on one vendor, which we're going to go ahead and do for our example. But if we left this filter open, it would give us the information for everyone. And on the Options tab, we're going to select the calendar year as 2011. I'll go ahead and preview this on screen, and we'll take a look at it together. You'll see here that our company information pulled through. We also have our vendor information, the federal ID number that we placed on the vendor card, and also the 1099 amount that we currently have to date. Now, you can receive pre-printed 1099 forms and print this report off, and from here you just simply submit this 1099 information. In our video today, we covered many things about 1099s. We defined a 1099 and identified who would typically receive a 1099. We also learned where to specify our 1099 information on our vendor card. We also learned how to process transactions for an individual that is 1099 liable. We learned how to edit 1099 information in the vendor ledger entries after transactions had been posted. And we also had taken a look at some reports that are available to you within Advantage to make 1099 reporting much easier. This concludes the video on 1099s. Be sure to watch all the videos in the RMI Advantage training series to help make your job easier. Thank you and have a great day.